Hi, so today I want to talk about 10 tips for growing tomatoes, and these tips actually work and they're great for beginners. So the first thing I want to talk about is choosing varieties. You want to make sure you're set up for success by choosing the right variety. And some of the more basic varieties there's like cherry and grape tomatoes, like the small ones. There's beefsteaks, there's saladettes, which are a little bit bitter than like a cherry or a grape, but smaller than a beefsteak. There's a paste tomato, which will be good if you want to like put down for sauce. Or there's slicers, which I love, and it's very easy to go crazy on those. But you want to kind of think about like how you're going to be using these and what you want to do with them. Like, you don't want to grow a lot of paste tomatoes if you're not going to be making a lot of sauce, or a lot of cherry tomatoes if you just don't enjoy eating them, and things along those lines. You want to think about what works best for you, because some of these varieties will have maybe more disease resistance than another. Some of them will need longer growing times than others, and maybe you don't have quite that time for it to work and grow in your zone. And you kind of just got to think about those things whenever you're researching what tomatoes you want to buy and grow. And then the next tip is to think about if your tomatoes are determinate versus indeterminate once you select them. A determinate tomato is only going to grow so big, and it's only going to put on so much fruit, and once it's done, it's kind of just going to be done. It's determinate. An indeterminate tomato would grow and grow and grow all season long until either the weather or the disease pressure kind of takes over, and then it's kind of done. But it'll get big and unruly and wild, and it's just something that you need to think about whenever you're thinking about, maybe like if you only have like a small container, you're going to want to determine it. But if you have an indeterminate, you're going to want to make sure that you have a lot of space for this tomato, and it's going to play into what type of trellising system you want and how much spacing to an extent you're going to want for these tomatoes. The third tip that I have is to think about timing. So it is May 15th today, and the last frost date for our zone is May 14th. Sometimes I go before the last frost to plant these tomatoes, but this year the weather's been kind of rough here. It's been very, very rainy and cold and all that stuff. So it hasn't really been optimal tomato planting conditions, but usually I look to see that there's no frost at night. Ideally, you'd like it to be at least like 50 degrees most nights whenever you put these out. You can put them out before the frost, and you can like still have success. You just might need to cover them up and make sure that they're covered so you don't lose them, because that'd be terrible to just lose all your tomatoes in the frost. And then you're also going to want to make sure that your soil is not overly wet, because there are times that here at least where it'll rain and rain and rain in the spring, and you don't want to be putting these plants in the soil that's just so wet and waterlogged that you're going to put them in and like it's just going to be very compacted soil. You want your soil, it doesn't have to be completely dry, but dry enough where you can work the soil and it's not miserable to work in and overly wet. So before you plant these too, you also want to make sure that your soil's prepped. Like, you want to have like maybe some new compost. I usually, in my in-ground beds and also my raised beds, I'll mix in a few inches of compost. Kind of just like, I usually will fork it in. I won't always do a full till just because it's better for the soil structure. But I kind of will just like lightly mix it in, and then I'll cover it up again with mulch. And then I also usually will add a fertilizer. This is the one I use a lot, but it's kind of just like an all-purpose fertilizer. And it is a 4-6 free, but it's just meant for like tomatoes, vegetables, and herbs. So So the next tip I have is to mulch your garden, and I have several types of mulch going on here. It doesn't have to be like anything wild or anything like that, but I use like grass clippings or easy straw and actual straw. This was left over from the winter, some of it, but it kind of just like is whatever you kind of have on hand or can get cheaply, but you want your soil covered, and that'll do two things. It'll help retain the moisture so that like moisture isn't just evaporating from your soil, and it also will help with weed suppression. I do have like a little bit of a weed problem going on right now just because I did have like some rye growing here, and I might have terminated a little bit too late, but I'm gonna get rid of that eventually. But this is gonna help a lot prevent like more weeds from coming. So another thing you can do too is you can use a living mulch. If you see right here, I have a nasturtium, and this will spread, and it's a great trap crop that'll help keep pests from other plants. But it'll be a living mulch as it'll spread over the soil, and it'll help keep moisture in as well and prevent weeds. Another thing that you want to plan in advance is your spacing, and this is really important because it's very easy to go wild with tomatoes, as I know, but you want to make sure that you have enough space for all the tomatoes that you're going to want to plant. These are all about 2 feet apart, and you just want to make sure that you have enough room for all of them and that they each have room for like good airflow. You don't want them too close or they'll get diseased and they won't produce as well for you. When you're thinking about your spacing too, you're going to want to consider whether you want to prune or not prune, because if you don't want to prune, you're going to want to put these much further apart, maybe even further than 2 feet. But if you're going to prune, you can put them closer together, and you can sometimes get away with a closer spacing. And this only applies to indeterminate tomatoes, because determinate you don't really want to prune because you're going to get rid of some of what you would harvest otherwise, unless it's like diseased or something that you just want to get rid of just for that disease prevention purposes. But just a quick guide on pruning, you want to prune off like suckers, which will develop like in say like the armpit of the tomato, almost like right in this area, and they will even grow another whole tomato plant if you cut them off and put them in water. But if you remove those, you'll get sometimes bitter tomatoes, and it'll help keep the plant healthier. You also want to take anything off that's going to touch the ground. Like say if this branch is touching the ground, I would want to take that off. You also want to have your support for these tomatoes planned out. Going back to the determinate versus indeterminate, you can usually get away with like these tomato cages for the determinate. Some people will also do what's called the Florida weave, where they'll kind of weed the tomatoes in between 2 T-posts, just because they are only going to get so big and they're not going to go wild. These indeterminate tomatoes, on the other hand, these are going to get kind of crazy. So this will be like up at the top of this cattle, or this will be at the top of this cattle panel at some point. These indeterminate tomatoes, on the other hand, these will get kind of crazy. Like this will be up at the top of this cattle panel at some point, just because they do get so big. So I usually use a cattle panel for mine, and I'll just kind of tie them up as they get bigger and kind of weave them through here. And that'll keep them supported. But you kind of want to have a plan growing in, just so that a few months from now you're not like, oh my gosh, how am I going to support these and keep them off the ground and keep them from going wild. Another thing to consider is water. You don't want to get water on the leaves as much as possible. Sometimes it's unavoidable based on your situation. But I use a drip tape. I find it works well for me, but it'll bring water to the base of the plant, and it helps keep the tomatoes water in a consistent manner without getting them diseased by getting the leaves just too wet. And then you also want to be mindful, you want these tomatoes to get about like the same amount of water consistently, because if you don't, they'll get what's called blossom end rot, where there'll be like the end of the tomato will develop a rot almost. And that can be somewhat avoided with consistent water, but sometimes it's unavoidable if you just like get a lot of rain or something happens where you can't water them consistently. So the next tip I have is to plant properly. And what that means is you're gonna wanna plant this plant pretty deep. So you're gonna wanna like take away some of these lower branches and put this plant in there pretty deep, just so that it can develop a stronger root system, because it'll actually develop roots all along here. So I'm gonna go ahead and plant. So I'm going to dig a deep hole. And then this is gonna sit down in there. And I'm gonna take these off and remove any suckers I happen to see, but this one does not have any. I'm just gonna backfill this hole. Put this label here and put this label here and put the mulch back around the plant. And it is done. So that's all for today. Be sure to like and subscribe for more gardening content. Thank you.